it just got, if it wasn't getting weird, it just got a bit weird.
I did read that. This is another thing I read.
He's screaming into the night.
They drew the penis out.
You know, Chris, I think you got all these extra copies of Watchmen. Whoever was stealing your DVDs you mentioned every other episode is giving you a copy of Watchmen.
That's my gravel voice.
Please put your pants back on.
Wait till he starts telling you about the toothpaste you just bought. It's going to be exciting.
All diet and no dong.
Hello and welcome to Movie Smash!
Welcome to Movie Smash, the podcast that looks at comic book movies outside the MCU that you may or may not remember. If you're the type of person that enjoys talking about hidden gems or just likes to tear old movies apart, this is the place for you. And with that, let's get started. I'm one of your hosts, Chris Roberts. I'm the founder of Off Panel Creations. And with me today, I've got Jeremy Parmentier.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Parmentier of the Retrovaniacs podcast, the band Subtastics, and a crime fighter in retirement.
And Fergel Amayo.
I'm actually Fergel Amayo, crime fighter in current action, so I'm taking over where Jeremy retired. And I'm also the owner of Gotham Knight Comics, where we get our nerd on. Dopest store in Livonia, Michigan. Come check us out.
See, that's the downside of always going first. I don't get to say something funny like that. You guys just set the tone. So our movie today, from the comments we've been hearing, is that it's 2009's Watchmen. It stars Jackie Haley, Patrick Wilson, Carly Giago, wow, messed that one up. Jeffrey Dean, directed by the famous Zach Snyder, coming off his 300 success.
It's a matter of time, I suppose.
Watchmen. One of us died tonight.
Harry had been working for the government.
Somebody knows why.
Maybe it was a political killing.
Somebody knows. Maybe someone's picking off costumed heroes.
There's going to be a nuclear war.
Before we jump in the movie tonight, I want to talk a little bit with you guys about sort of what is your experience before going to this. This comes from a very famous comic book. So what was your experience before this movie?
So for myself, I mean, this is an amazing comic book. It's actually still one of the best comics to this day, and it's probably one of Alan Moore's quintessential works. I mean, it's a dope book that takes and deconstructs a superhero kind of scenario. So I thought it was really cool. I read it as a kid, and I just was absolutely enamored by the whole book. And I mean, it came out in '86. I read the story. I could not imagine enjoying that book. It was a great. So when they brought it to life, I was like, wow. This is going to be interesting.
You know, the last few shows, I've been the guy who's like, yeah, I had no idea what this was. I saw the movie. Maybe I'll check out the comic. I don't necessarily want to be that guy. It just is who I am half the time. In this case, though, I did know this was a comic. I did not read it at the time, but when the movie was going to come out, all my comic book friends from when I stored at the comic store was like, dude, how did you not read this when you worked here? You literally just walked around and read, graphic novels. How did you not read this? And so I went out, picked it up, read it right before the movie started because I was like, okay, everyone said there's no way this movie is going to be as good as the source material. I got to read it this time. So for the first time since probably Turtles, I was familiar with this before watching the movie.
See, this is what Jeremy does. He's the one that's bringing up the cool factor. I think I'm just trying to keep up with this guy right now.
Well, for me personally, I had not heard of the Watchmen before the movie was announced, but my local comic book shop, I went there for board games, told me I had to read it. He just gave me a copy of the thing. And strangely enough, I actually have 6 copies of this book. I don't know how that has happened. I don't know where they've come from, but for myself, I read that book. I knew what it was, but I actually did not see the movie in theaters when it came out.
You know, Chris, I think you got all these extra copies of Watchmen. Whoever was stealing your DVDs you mentioned every other episode is giving you a copy of Watchmen in return.
that might be the exchange program. For little I know, I'm running a library of DVDs, and the price is The Watchmen.
Well, there's a movie about a guy who collected every copy of a particular record, and he would literally get it from everywhere and get people to bring him stuff for just this one record. I think they made an entire movie about it. So that is a plausible theory, Chris.
That is my life. So did you guys, obviously it sounds like you guys both saw this movie, but do you remember the experience when you saw this movie for the first time?
I thought they did a great job. It's hard. So I say, and Jeremy, you're going to agree with me 100%. Chris, you're going to agree with me too. It's hard.
I'm not.
This is probably This is probably one of the hardest things to take source material. You couldn't fit it all in the movie, but it's like Snyder lifted scenes right from the book and put them in the movie, and that to me is, I mean, it's awesome. So, well, it missed, like I was saying earlier, my favorite part is like the intro scene where they're the snapshot and they're going through that whole intro. If just watch the first 2 minutes of it, you'll be like, that is phenomenal.
Yeah, I saw it at the time, and I was very impressed at how close it was to a point to the source material, right? I read the book right before I went to go see this, and so I was like, there's no way this movie's going to hold up to what this story actually is. And for the most part, I think it's very, very close. They do make some changes. Some are just minor changes that really don't upset the flow of the movie, and specifically one major plot point is 100% different, but it's still, I thought, was a pretty good version of what they, making this source material, which is kind of unique and interesting, still really work as a movie.
I feel like I say this very often, but I did not see this movie in theaters. I got the graphic novel in anticipation of it, but
there's no local theater near you. That's your problem.
Well, at the time I was in the middle of a move, as they seem to do every 3 years, but I did buy the DVD when it came out. And that was my first experience with it. We'll talk more about that later, but your initial thoughts around this, Jeremy, you kind of mentioned the ending of it. Besides that, how was your overall take of it?
When I saw it the first time, I thought, wow, they really did nail, for the most part, all the beats of the story that I remembered, right? I thought this was a pretty good, it has all the same characters. There's things that seemed really familiar, and watching it again now, there's things that are literally line for line and scene for scene, which is great. And it's done it feels like it still works for a movie. It doesn't feel like they're just reading comic book pages, right? So I thought it was very good. Again, without getting into the ending at this point, because we're 3 minutes in, the ending was shocking at the time in the movie theater, because I was like, why? Because they changed it. They changed the ending, sort of, right? The ultimate end is still the end, but like it's not what's in the comic at all, and it was kind of a jarring moment. But other than that, I thought it was pretty close to the source material.
Agreed. I kind of agree with you 100%. I think it was a great, I saw it in IMAX. So, I was blown away with the fight scenes. I was blown away with how they did it. The ending was a bit shocking. But I think that also spoke to, some of the backstories of the characters. They missed a few beats in that. There were a couple parts that were not quite as the same, but, to the point where, it's really hard to lift pages and put them on the main screen. Oftentimes they source material, but they don't lift the pages. This guy lifted pages.
You've sort of touched on it, but for a little bit, but what sort of, do you have any comic book history for us? Any bit of lore?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of Alan Moore's quintessential works. It sort of comes off of him doing, the book before this was Camelot 3000. So I don't know if you've read that book. I own all of them. They're amazing.
I did read that. This is another thing I read.
This is another story so Alan Moore had just written that story, and it was great. I mean, it was great. It was probably one of the best Arthurian stories you ever read. So this was his next story, and it broke the board in terms of just changing the storylines. It came out, won a ton of awards. He won a Hugo Award. Dave Gibbons was phenomenal. The artistry was amazing. It was its own separate kind of artistry, as its own separate kind of story. He wasn't well known. Funny fact is Dave Gibbons was not very well known outside of this story. This was, I think Alan Moore was well known, but he wasn't. So really great overall story. Just a cool comic book.
Okay, well, with that, let's sort of jump right into the movie. For those that don't know, the plot of this movie is it takes place in the year 1985. Superheroes have been around since the, I think, mid-30s, and it has changed the course of history as we know it. The movie opens with the murder of a retired hero. His name is the Comedian. Rorschach, he's one of the remaining active crime fighters out there, begins an investigation into his murder, and he's looking for a potential mass murderer, or mass killer, as he calls him. And quickly, the story unfolds into a vast conspiracy. And just a quick little note for everybody. One last thing before finally jump into it. We'll be discussing a lot of the plot of this thing. So if you don't want spoilers, go watch this thing, come back, because we're going to discuss some elements of the story that might be considered spoilers, especially the ending of this thing.
You have been warned.
Consider yourself warned, exactly. I keep saying before we jump in it, one last thing. What version of this movie did you guys watch?
Everything Everywhere All at Once. No, I watched the original theatrical cut and then, the original theatrical release. And then just because of time constraints, I watched the HBO Max cut, which was still great.
I didn't know that there was a difference between the original theatrical release and the Max cut. I did see the theatrical release when it was new, but then I watched the Max cut for this. I thought that was the original release.
Yeah, personally, me being overprepared, I watched the theatrical cut before watching this. I also rewatched the ultimate cut, and I have seen the director's cut of this thing. And I have actually seen the director's cut with maximum movie mode, which we can get to a little bit later too. So I have thoroughly seen this movie.
Can we just take a few minutes and direct ourselves to the point that you have so much free time?
It's amazing all the things I get done. So let's jump into the movie itself. Let's start with the characters, because the characters make up a huge portion of this movie.
I just think they're a different viewpoint. They're, as I said I said at the beginning, I'm gonna say it again. It's a deconstructed superhero movie. It's a deconstructed superhero story. That's what made it a great story, because, there are different viewpoint, like Night Owl, kind of a Batman without the self-confidence, Rorschach, a violent detective who could be mistaken for a criminal, Dr. Manhattan, omnipotent hero tethered to a man, Silk Spectre, like a Black Widow, but more jaded. And I am dopely amazed at Asmodeus. I thought they did a great job pairing that. I don't think they gave enough to his backstory, because they put him in a Nazi family and he's not. There's a really cool Asmodeus backstory, but he was well portrayed. Great character portrayal. Even the comedian was amazing.
And all these characters feel very similar to, standard comic book archetype characters, like you said, which is good, because if they try to do this same movie or I guess same comic with the original characters that these are loosely based on or whatever, they wouldn't be able to have the freedom of making them feel human, because that's really a lot of this is taking these superheroes, but you're seeing their private lives. You're seeing what's going on with them. Either they've retired or they're in hiding, or they're out right in the open because they're actively, helping the government, like Dr. Manhattan. But it still shows them as more human than superhero. They have their powers, they do all the things they do, but it humanizes them, and they have flaws, massive flaws. You'd never see it's happened, but there probably wouldn't be a movie with a Superman with a flaw like what you'd see in Dr. Manhattan. So it's neat to have these very similar characters that everyone can kind of immediately go, oh, I know who that's supposed to be, sort of. But then you can, because of that, you have the freedom to do whatever you want.
It's interesting too, because there are actually two groups of superheroes. There's the group from the 30s, and then there's a group from now, or in the 80s, if you would. And one of the past is shown in flashbacks. But it's funny how you guys say these characters kind of remind you of somebody. They aren't just sort of light taking of characters. This is actually this cadre of characters, if you would, is actually from Charlton Comics, meaning that when DC bought Charlton Comics back in 1983, they also got their characters with it. And each one of these is a one-to-one pairing of characters from those comics that when it was purchased, they were originally going to use these comics for the story, these characters for these stories. But when DC realized what he was going to do with these characters, they said, you can't use them straight. Just give them a different name. So an example for you, like Rorschach, he's the Question. Dr. Manhattan is Captain Atom. Night Owl is the original Blue Beetle. Silk Spectre is Nightshade. Ozymandias is Thunderbolt. And the comedian is Peacemaker.
Interesting. That's really interesting, because they have no bearing whatsoever.
Well, I didn't know that, but again, because they are, very standard kind of archetypes for what you'd see in these comics, even without that knowledge, there's still characters in the DC and Marvel universes that kind of tie to the kind of thing you're thinking about. Like I thought, for example, the comedian was kind of supposed to be a take on like the Punisher, but with the Joker mixed in, right? Like that kind of a mix of characters, but still very familiar without knowing them.
Oh, without a doubt. And I think that the actors they chose for these roles were fantastic. In fact, Jackie Haley is the only one who actually read the comic before, getting the part. He actually campaigned to be Rorschach in this thing.
That's pretty amazing. That's interesting that you say that. I would never have thought the Blue Beetle. I was actually more in line with what Jeremy was mentioning, with the kind of the comedian, more like Punisher, with a little bit of the Joker thrown in there. But it's interesting, because these characters you mentioned, they all have great comic stories. They're all still out there doing different things now. So it's kind of interesting that they're in that. You must have got that from the Ultimate Cut. That's all I can say. I mean, that sounds like one of those maxims that you overlay stuff on.
Well, I mean, you mentioned the comedian. A little fun fact for you. The original director for this movie was not Zach Snyder. It was Tim Burton, and he was going to cast Johnny Depp as the comedian.
Oh, that would have been a bad call.
Yeah,
that just would have been a bad call.
Luckily for us, he was too busy doing Sweeney Todd and Alice in Wonderland, so he passed.
That fits. Let's leave it with Zach Snyder. No, Zach Snyder did it amazing, and I'm just, as I said, here's another fun fact. You know that Billy Crudup's head was Frankenstein on Daniel Pruitt's body, a workout guy, and that Daniel Pruitt, who was a physical actor for Dr. Manhattan, wore a light suit that was like glowing blue the entire time. It was like a light motion suit that was blue, and in the comic has sex. Now they do all kinds of screwing in this movie.
They sure do. Actually, you mentioned Dr. Manhattan. Do you know who the original person that was going to be Dr. Manhattan was?
Not at all.
I do, and you'd never know it was Don Knotts. No, I'm kidding. That can't be true.
Are you reading my notes? No, it's Keanu Reeves was going to be the original Dr. Manhattan.
Interesting. Another glad not happened choice.
But for once, not Nick Cage.
That's a damn shame. Nick Cage needs to be everywhere.
So you sort of started touching upon it, Fergel, about the effects, because you mentioned Dr. Manhattan with the blue suit. How'd you guys feel about the effects? How do they hold up, so many years later?
The fight scenes were amazing. I mean, I think, use this movie and template out the boys. Just stop right there. I mean, so many different stories post this movie pick up these fight scenes. Most fight scenes now show the slow motion opportunities. They're much more graphic and in detail. I just think this movie kind of set the bar on so many different fronts.
Yeah, it's got a ton of that slowdown for the action scenes, but not to the point where it's obnoxious. It's very graphic, but in a way that is completely over the top comic books, so still works for me. And the blueness, we mentioned Dr. Manhattan. He is very blue. And knowing that he had a light suit, that actually makes a lot of sense, because there's every time he's in there, because he is blue, everything kind of reflects that blue. Also, if you ever wanted to see a giant blue man with a penis out, this is the movie for you.
Oh, yeah. Now that one, that is it in the comic or was it in the movie? Was he walking around Vietnam? Because I thought he had the black suit on. Or were we watching the Max cut where they drew that bad boy in there?
They drew a penis in for the Max cut? Well, I guess that makes sense. You pay for Max every month, you want that extra.
No, I think the Max cut, they drew the penis out. I think it's maybe Chris, you could shed some light on this. You've got the ultimate cut.
The answer is no. He wore a black suit when he's taking over Vietnam.
That's because in the comic they got him out there doing the dangly business, and honestly, that would have frightened me more than him blowing people up.
Well, it's still in here. It still happens in this movie when the sex scene's going on where there's multiple versions of him. He is naked and just standing in the room in the other part of that. So he does. That's more what I was talking about. But you're right. In Vietnam, in the comic, it is you get some giant blue dong. Here, you don't see that.
That's why they wanted to surrender to him. I'm sorry, that was completely off topic.
I don't even know how to transition out of that, guys. Actually, you know what? I kind of do. So that's one of those small little details or large details, however you want to take that happen in the background. Like they're not just outright saying it, it's happening. Did you notice all the small details in there, such as like the U.S. flag had 51 stars on it, not 50, because Vietnam was a state.
Yes, I mean, we kind of talked about how superheroes have changed the course of time. In this movie, the whole background is that the U.S. wins Vietnam because they send Dr. Manhattan and other superheroes to win the war, right? Because what are you going to do if you're fighting against an army you can't defeat because of their just in general they're using the land to their advantage. They know where to hide. They're fighting for their own survival. But if you send in a giant blue radioactive guy who's also hanging dong everywhere, you're gonna give up. So yes, they brought him in. They then win Vietnam, and therefore Richard Nixon's like president forever. It works out like it. When I read the comic, I understood that to some level. In the movie, the first time I saw it, I remembered it, but it didn't seem as important as it was when I watched it this time again. It's like, how did I not pay more attention to that part of it? There is all this background things like what Chris mentioned, the flag has 51 stars. That's all stuff that's really neat that they rolled in with it that I just kind of took as background noise, but it really is a lot of detail.
The one thing I think they missed on was how Dr. Manhattan got that circle on his head. I'm going to say it outright. They didn't give us any opportunity. That was such a pivotal comic scene. Why didn't they do that? That would have probably been my biggest disappointment when he first walked in the talk show and they wanted to give him kind of a logo and he drew his own logo. That was dope. Come on, guys.
Well, then you need to watch the ultimate cut.
Is it there?
20-minute scene.
Man.
20-minute scene.
Yeah, it's 20 minutes.
20-minute scene. Okay.
It's just all dialogue. And no dong. I'm sorry. given how many times you guys have brought it up, I think that the episode title needs being Hanging Dong. I mean,
well, I mean, again, if you were a Vietnamese and there's a 10, 20-foot dong coming at you, you're gonna give up too.
Well, there are other references in there too, not just one such as like the Keenan Act of 1977, which outlaws superheroes, or obviously Zack Snyder just came off his 300 success for this. 300 is mentioned or referenced within this movie a couple different times. I don't know if you guys noticed it. Did you catch the couple references in there?
No, I didn't. And that's probably because I just recently watched it and I had a million things going on. But where was that? Where did I miss that at? Is that in the ultimate cut as well?
No, that's not. That's in the normal cut. So in the room number for the comedian's 300, which they do a nice zoom slow-mo of, so you can't miss it. So the Spartan 300 movie is also on the TVs at Veight's lair at the end, I guess. All the TVs he has on the wall. But actually, this is not in the movie 300, the movie Watchmen, but actually in the trailer for 300, if you freeze the frame at 1 minute and 52 seconds, Rorschach is in the trailer for 300, just as a heads up.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And that's a Snyder thing. I'm definitely down for that, man. That's like signing your movies.
But I mean, now I do want to talk about the opening sequence a little bit. What did you guys think about that? 'Cause that stands on its own to me.
You're talking about the fight because
I'm talking about it shows the past. It basically shows all of American history being caught up for us.
Best scene in the entire movie. Probably hands out one of the most iconic scenes. And that's why I told you, if someone didn't want to watch this movie and just had 2 minutes and 49 seconds or 3 minutes, just watch that beginning scene before you even get to the comedian. Just watch that scene. It'll be enough to make you happy.
When we talked about the Justice League New Frontier, or whatever it was called, that's what that reminded me of, right? That intro where it kind of goes through the different history, the different versions of what is happened in this universe. That's why that was very familiar to me when we watched it. I was like, oh, this is kind of like DC's version, even though Watchmen was DC, of the Watchmen. They kind of take this idea where superheroes are outlawed and they've gotten more involved with world politics. Well, that's what the intro of this movie is, but with these characters.
The two that stood out for me was one, the comedian kills JFK.
Yes. Yep.
That one stood out to me a little bit. I was shocked about that.
And the other one is Night Owl stops the mugging of Martha and Thomas Wayne.
That I didn't recognize them as Martha and Thomas Wayne. It just completely. Now that you say, how do you know that was Martha and Thomas Wayne?
It's the posters on the wall are for the movie.
The Mask of Zorro.
Yeah, or whatever play they saw. That's what was on the wall for what they're coming out of. And she has a bunch of pearls. And
is the boy holding the playbill?
I believe so.
So that would be pretty dope. Now you're going to make me go back.
I think you need to go back and watch the ultimate cut and watch your 4-hour extravaganza. So these effects, just to touch on the effects a little bit, this movie is just full of slow-mos. I mean, if you got rid of every slow-mo, it'd probably be like an hour-and-a-half movie. It is just littered with them. They're all great shots. The movie had over 200 sets and took over 5 months to film the entire thing. This was an endeavor, to say the least. But we sort of start touching on it a little bit, guys. Plot. Let's sort of really deep into it. So the plot of the movie, obviously it's straight from the comics, but there have been some changes.
I think the end of the movie, it shaped itself up really nicely that you thought we were heading towards the ending, and the ending was so completely off the beaten path that was probably the one big takeaway is like, what was so horrible about creating that ending around the way it was originally envisioned? He had already done so much that was literally pulled directly from the panels of the comic. Why didn't he make the ending? So I'm still at loss for that. I still don't understand that.
I had some thoughts on it. So I guess we've already kind of warned you we're going to talk about the plot, but we're really going to talk about the ending in detail here. I think that's the only way to make this make any sense to some level. So the whole plot of the movie is Rorschach eventually figures out, with the help of Night Owl and the other superheroes coming back, kind of who is behind this killing of the comedian, but also kind of other superheroes that have been targeted, but for the purpose, right? And it's of course one of their own who's decided that he's going to save the world by causing a catastrophe. Now in the comic book, that catastrophe is he genetically engineers some giant tentacled monster that also somehow is attached to a some kind of mentalist that was able to
Well, they kidnapped a bunch of scientists, artists, dentists. He had this whole thing, this whole operation where he was creating this monster of such unequal proportion that it would make people have a complete mind meld. They would kill millions of people instantly.
Well, it was that like when the monster would show up, it basically dies almost instantly on on arrival, but then it has some like psychic burst that comes out too that destroys everything, right? So it's got this giant, literal like tentacle monster that shows up in the middle of the city and does a whole bunch of damage. Well, the movie instead changes that, and instead it is, quote, more realistic that instead he's been working with Dr. Manhattan this whole time to build what he's been saying is kind of an ultimate power for the world, so they never run out of power. But instead he's designing bombs based on the power of Dr. Manhattan, and he basically causes them all to go off at once, destroying a huge chunk of the world, but making it look like it's from Dr. Manhattan, right? So the world will now unite around this new enemy and stop the Cold War that's basically coming to a head in this movie. I liked the change in that I thought it made more sense as to why Dr. Manhattan vanishes, right? He realizes like, okay, well, you've succeeded, and now the world is we've diverted this Cold War. I don't know if it's going to last long. In fact, he kind of hints that it probably won't. But then he leaves. He was going to leave anyway. He didn't want to be on Earth anymore because he just wasn't comfortable here. And people, he's so beyond the rest of Earthlings, he's going to go out and be a god somewhere else, right? But instead, in this, he now has this extra layer of, I can't come back because if they find me, then it's going to either ruin the illusion that I'm still watching everybody, and you have to stay on your toes at all times in case I come back, or they'll eventually figure out he didn't do this, right? So he vanishes. In the comic, instead, he does vanish, but there's a lot more backstory, I think, to Dr. Manhattan in the comic to kind of explain why he doesn't want to be here anymore, where the movie doesn't have that kind of time to give him that character. So I didn't mind the ending for that, but at the time I was sure when I first saw it, I was like, well, it's probably because they tried to film the tentacle monster and it looked stupid, so they didn't. And I thought this was easier to film because it's just explosions. Great. But now I don't know if that's the case or not.
No, that's the great mystery. Unless, Chris, your ultimate cut will shed some light on this.
No, the cut doesn't. I do some information for you. But Jeremy, I agree with you that I think this was a better cohesive ending for the movie, right? That the fact that we did not have time to fully understand Dr. Manhattan. So this gave a plausible reason why he just leaves and the world unites behind him around all that. Now, that's funny. This was actually not the original ending that the original script had when it was first written. And that I do have for you. So the original plan was that Veight's plan was to change the world, was to go back in time. He was going to assassinate John Osterman with a sniper rifle before he becomes Dr. Manhattan. And they stop him. And Dr. Manhattan kills Veidt because he kills Veidt. And then Dr. Manhattan realized this is actually a good idea and destroys himself, causing a rift in time and space. And then everyone is sucked into an alternate dimension, discover a world where there are actually characters in a comic book. And they decide to pick up crime fighting in this new world. I kid you not. That was the original ending that was going to be made for this movie.
That's bad. That's terrible.
Wow. Somebody smoked. That's a lot of burning of a lot of pot at that point. I mean, there's no other way that idea comes to fruition. was that the Tim Burton cut?
No, that's the Sam Hamm cut. Yeah, seeing that, I'm like, I am glad they went with the Manhattan. Just leaves.
Well, I mean, so they did give me the Mars scene. I mean, so they gave me the whole glass scene. They gave that. That was very intricate. That's why I assumed they were going to take it the rest of the way. They even had the intrinsic field reactor. So, I mean, you kind of, and Bustastos, the dog, you had you were leading right to it. And then it just was completely off the beaten path. So, I mean, that's why to this point, you're like, well, why is that ending? But the movie is still dope. I mean, it's, I think where they made the mistake, and I know it's critically acclaimed, and I'm going to be the lone voice, is when they decided to make the 34 years after Watchmen HBO show. That, I don't care if it's critically acclaimed. I know it is. I know it's a great show, but that was unneeded.
I don't think it was needed. I liked it. I have to say, I enjoyed it, but I didn't. I've read nothing I know there's other books that have come out that maybe Alan Moore had nothing to do with. I don't really know for the Watchmen universe. There was something recently, I think in the last couple of years that was
the Doomsday Clock.
I didn't read any of that. Yeah. Like I was like, I don't.
But that was plausible because of the Flashpoint paradox. So that was plausible. The only way that was plausible was Flashpoint paradox.
Well, but my point was like not reading anything other than this original work. I wasn't expecting anything when they said there was an HBO show based on the Watchmen. I saw the like even the trailer for it, like the previews, like this has nothing to do with Watchmen, but I'll watch it because it's HBO and I watch most of their shows and it's probably good. And I did thoroughly enjoy it, and it does tie back to this sort of thing. But again, it's not. It's kind of like an offshoot of this. It doesn't really continue the story. It does overall continue like the universe, but it doesn't. It's not it's not integral that you have watched Watchmen to enjoy that, but it's also fine if you did watch Watchmen and not like that. Like, there's no real tie. You're not going to see, with the exception of one main character, you're not going to really see anybody else from this in that Watchmen TV show.
No, but what would have been really cool is if we could make a movie about what happens when the New Frontiersman opens Rorschach's journal, and really dive into that. I know that the HBO show tried to, because it wasn't really tied into, but if we could really just put a focus on Rorschach's journals, that would have been, because the world found out, and that would have been cool.
Well, it's interesting you bring up the journal. I mean, to sort of circle back to the plot a little bit, the movie, and we didn't mention it, so I do want to mention it. The movie is actually told from his perspective. Though you can't really tell that while you're watching necessarily, but all the scenes at the end of the day, if you go back and watch that movie and think to yourself, this is Rorschach watching this all unfold, it takes a different take, because he's actually in most scenes in the background. Yeah. In fact, if you watch the ultimate cut or the director's cut, there's more scenes where he's walking past the camera with that "the end is nigh" sign over his shoulder. And there's a scene where Night Owl and Silk Spectre are having dinner together. But if you notice, they're sitting behind the glass. Like, the camera's on another piece of glass looking through, right? You'll notice there's like a little sheen to it. It's because it's Rorschach on the street watching them.
That would make sense. He was a bit of a creepy dude.
Oh, he's super creepy.
And that's why is it Haley Earl Jones? I can't remember the actor's name. He played Freddy Krueger, but he was made for that role. That was again part of, I think, Snyder's magic to this movie. He cast exactly who he needed to cast to make this movie work.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, Jackie Haley is the only cast member who actually has read that comic before he was told about it. He said, "I want to be Rorschach." Like, he wanted that role, period.
Well, it kind of works then. If the whole thing's from him, he's the one narrating the movie. He's the one who's kind of keeping the notes. It's great that he'd be the only person ahead of time that knew what they were getting into.
Tone-wise, we've sort of touched up on a little bit. How do you guys feel about the tone of this movie?
I think it matches. I think it's. I think it keeps with the book. I think it keeps the comic. For again, someone who is a nerd impossible, or a master nerd such as myself, may miss on those little details that I think make a difference. Like I mentioned Veidt's background, right? They pasted him as a Nazi. He rebuilt himself because he was a Nazi family. But in the comic, he walks away from his wealth, but not because it's a Nazi, but because he believes he can do it himself. And so he takes the journey of Alexander, who cut the knot at Macedonia, and all the things he did there. And so those are things that make a difference in the story, but they're little points. They're extra nerd points. If you're just watching this, it runs nice. It's a little long, but it's a great movie.
Yeah, I had to watch this in two breaks. When I saw it in the theater, I saw it, obviously all at once. But for this podcast, even though I knew what I was doing, I also wanted to kind of look at the comic while I was watching it. So I'd watch, 30, 40 minutes of this, then go back and read through the comic up to that point and see what was different. So there were lots of little differences that I wouldn't have noticed without doing that thing. Like, for example, when Rorschach in the comic, he kind of goes around to all these retired superheroes and warns them that someone's killing superheroes. He goes to Veidt's office in the evening and warns him. In this, instead, Night Owl does it in the middle of the day, and they also are able to then tie in when all the reporters and stuff are there. So it all worked, but there are little changes there. The biggest thing I noticed, aside from the ending that clearly was totally different, was the or at least the method of getting to the ending is different. Dr. Manhattan himself, I felt when I read it in the comic, he still felt like he was more human. I think in the movie version, he's already otherworldly, right? He already feels like he's on another different universe than the rest of us. He's here, but he's always doing other things. In the comic, you kind of saw that gradually happen to the point where he becomes that, but in especially the earlier parts of the comic, he still felt like he was having human reactions to things, right? And maybe that's in how I read it as opposed to seeing someone act it out on the screen. But I thought that was a big difference for me.
Well, they fleshed him out more. Remember, part of his journey in the comic was going back to how it all began. Now, I know they went back through and they kind of touched on it in the movie, but they really hammered on it in the comic. And you can see it as he walks through. So I think that was probably, I agree. And I think there were, like I said, the end scene was probably a big one. And there were a few other small ones, but yeah, I agree. I thought that's an interesting take, Jeremy.
So what about pacing? How'd you feel about the pacing of this movie overall? Because, let's be honest, this movie, for some people, was about 3 hours, and for others, like me, it was a 4-hour movie.
Well, I would. You'd have to make it a Friday or Saturday night. I think that'd be the only way it works. But if you're gonna Friday or Saturday night where your spouse goes to sleep, or you're just wanting to chill, or you want to do a date night, this is a movie to watch. And I think it paces well. I think you don't notice that 3 hours have went by, which always makes it a good movie. Now, when you're trying to watch it as part of this, yeah, because you're slowing it down. But if you're just watching it for the first time, you're not going to see 3 hours go by.
I think if I would have been the person this time who had not read the comic and then watched it, I wonder if there's things that I would have thought this is too long, doesn't need to be there, and I still would have gotten the same end storyline out of it. I think as an adaptation of this series, it needs to be as long as it is, and they still had to cut some stuff out. There's lots of things that I'm sure in the ultimate cut that were not in this that were in the comic, but it still had most of the beats. It had most of the, every chapter, every different comic in there. You can see like, here's where they cut it, here's where they cut it, here's where they cut it, here's where they pulled it from. There's scenes that are exactly like framed out the same way with the same dialogue. I mean, it's a really good version of this comic, but I don't know if I would think it's too long had I not read that comic first. This is probably the only time I'll get to say that sentence. So I'm very excited that I got to do so.
We have broken it first, ladies and gentlemen. Jeremy has enjoyed it because he enjoyed the book first.
Well, I got to say, I think pacing wise, it did not feel like a 3-hour movie, to say the least. If you're a person, well, we'll get into a recommendation a bit later on about which one you should be seeing, but yeah, I'd say pacing wise, it was good. I mean, if you like Zach Snyder films and you're used to his slow motion that he just uses quite often, you're going to be fine with it. If not, you're right, Jeremy. There are times where you say to yourself, if I had not read the book, if I didn't know what I was getting into, I might say this is dragging at some points, but generally speaking, I think it moves along nicely. So overall, guys, how do you feel about it?
I think it hits. I think it's a good movie. It to Jeremy's point, I think we've been hammering at this for a bit of time now. And I think, again, if someone hasn't, first off, I'd tell every person, if you want to read a book you had that will kind of blow you out a little bit, read this book. It's really interesting in a lot of ways. And I think if you then go watch the movie, even read one or two chapters and then go watch the movie, you're going to be blown away. And even if you've not, I think you're still going to be blown away by how it's well made. You can't hit everything, but to your point, Jeremy, it's like they lifted dialogue and scenes and they 4D'd them, and it's really hard to do. You kind of think this is not that easy to do, to 4D something and bring it into life and then make it look good.
Yeah, no, it's very impressive. I definitely, I definitely liked this movie. I would definitely watch this again. I did watch it for this, and I would just be curious. Like, I know my wife has seen it once, and I don't know if she ever has any interest in seeing it again because it is a little bit long, and she isn't familiar with the source material. This is one of the few things where I'd say, you almost have to have read the book. You don't need to understand it, but I think to really appreciate it for what it is, you really do want to read it.
Agreed.
Yeah, I'm with you on Jeremy. I think to truly enjoy this movie for what it has, read the book first. Overall, I love this movie. I can't say it enough. As you can tell, because I've watched it so many times at this point and so many different versions of this point. I love this movie. I love the cinematography behind it all. I love the Easter eggs, the true Easter eggs that are planted throughout the whole thing. And there's just so much to see, and I catch new stuff every time I watch it again. So personally, I just love this film. I love the different versions for different reasons. But to truly appreciate this film, you got to read that book. That doesn't mean you have to read the book, but you should read the book. I guess it sort of segues right into it, guys. Should people go out and seek this movie?
Yes, I think this is a great movie. Again, I do recommend reading the book first, but even if you didn't, it is a very enjoyable, albeit a little bit long, take on a superhero movie. But again, without all the trappings of, if you were going out to see a new Batman movie, you kind of already know what you're in line for. This gives you a clean slate that, as long as you like superheroes at all, you'll probably enjoy what's going on here.
I would most assuredly recommend, and where I would differ with both of you guys, just in the fact that so I'm going to say it like this: best experience, read the source material. Best experience. But even if most people who went and drugged themselves to Endgame, Infinity, all the multiple superheroes they watched out, if they want to see a movie, I heard the word clean slate. This is a movie to go see. If you even like the superhero but want to change it up, this is the movie that's going to do. And within the first 10 minutes, you're going to be like, wow, and knock it off your seat. You'll hold your pee.
Yeah, so for me, I'd say go see it. And I'd say, like I said, I've seen all 4 versions of this thing. If you've not read the source material, go watch the theatrical cut. enjoy it. It's a great movie. You'll enjoy yourself. Grab some popcorn, relax. If you've read the book, I'd recommend watching the director's cut. And that's just because it adds things like Hollis's death is in there. It adds more scenes where you see Rorschach in the background, that kind of stuff. Now, once you've watched one of those two, and you say to yourself, I want to get the full comic book experience, go watch the ultimate cut. Because what it does, it adds even more scenes in there. If you remember the book, there are scenes where there's a newsstand and a guy's talking to this kid.
Yes.
Those scenes are now in the ultimate cut. And they bookend going into the actual comic book. The Black Freighter comic book is actually in the ultimate cut as a motion, as a cartoon, as an animated cartoon. So it actually goes into those as well and segues back in again with those newsstand scenes, and it's flawless. So if you're saying to yourself, you know what, I've read the book, I love the movie, and I want to see the full experience, go watch that version of it. And you can do it over several days. You'll enjoy it either way, because it actually takes everything from the comic that it could and shoves it into that 4-hour movie. And it does it well. It does not slog on. I did it in just 1.5 sittings, meaning I got through most of it and just had to go to sleep. So I did the part I missed. Now, if you're a cinephile, I mean, you love movies, I would recommend going to go watch the Maximum Movie Mode on the director's cut, because what that does as you're watching it, it actually zooms out on occasion and Zach Snyder talks to you about the scene and how they did the special effects, how it works, what their pacing thoughts were, and then it goes back into the movie again. So if you enjoy how movies are made, I'd go with that. I'd go with the Maximum Movie Mode after you've watched the movie at some point. But it's the full-length movie they're doing for the entire thing. So I guess the question, guys, is we know my answer on this already, but would you rewatch this movie anytime soon?
I just did.
I would. I don't know if I'd do it again as quickly, like in the next week or so, but I definitely watch this again. I think it's a great self-standing story. And even though I would also gladly read this source book again. So
yes, I agree on that. I would sit down and make this book bathroom reading material.
I actually just picked up the omnibus for the before Watchmen, just because I want to know more about the lore. There is so much.
I've got there's a movie theater. There's a whole kind of compendium set, not just the omnibus, but there's a 2 books tied directly to the movie. I've got both of those. I mean, they're part of my personal collection along with the original graphic novel.
Well, I know this movie's relatively recent, so a remake is probably not in the cards for us. So the question, I guess, is, ignoring the HBO spinoff, should they keep expanding this universe? Should they go back to it again and do a deeper dive?
Too close. I think it resonates, but I think this was an 2009 movie. I think we can't really put something like this out today. I think we got to leave. This is too close to reality in a lot of regards, and oftentimes movies can be too close. I think this one needs to kind of hang, and it's an opus. I think it's, quite frankly, it's Snyder's and Moore's opus. I think when you think about from a story point of view, this is, you mentioned in the ultimate cut, this was the 4-hour opus. This was the they didn't jam that all in there, all the extra stuff, and I mean it's part and parcel one of the best superhero movies ever made.
No, I don't think you want a remake of this. I think, again, because you're coming as close to the source material as you're going to, and I think refilming it for any reason to add the other original ending, I guess, doesn't, I mean, the original comic ending, not the original movie ending that was terrible, but the original comic ending, I don't think is needed. I think it's fine. We mentioned the HBO series. I do recommend that. But again, it feels more like it's a story in this universe, but it doesn't necessarily tie to this. It does, but you don't need it to.
Yeah, I mean, I've always liked more lore. I always like more information. So I'd love to see something else tangential to this. I don't want to revisit those characters again. I enjoyed that HBO series, Jeremy, not because it tied in directly. I just enjoyed the series. So I think, I'd like to just revisit that world where superheroes became a thing in the 30s, of a more real reality versus just sort of, the superhero movies we see today. So rating wise, guys, using the patented Fergel method of rating movies, how would you rate this thing?
I'm giving it 2 thumbs.
You only get one. You only get one.
Then I'm giving it
it's your system.
I'm giving it a thumb and a big toe.
Our system doesn't make any sense, but I'm also giving it a thumb up. But I think, again, it's if you could go higher than a thumb, if you could go like a thumb and then your other thumb is partly up, even though you're only matching it at one thumb, I would give it that if you read the book first. Otherwise, it's just a thumb.
So thumb and some light reading.
I think a thumb and a big toe will take this thing all the way.
I give it a thumbs up as well. So before we move on, guys, we actually have a piece of mailbag again. We're actually getting these on a regular basis. So just for those who are listening, if you want to send us a note, it could be telling us how poorly we're doing, how great we're doing, or anything, or even a movie suggestion. Just take a look at www.movie-smash.com. There's a form on there. Fill it out. You don't have to use your real information. Just send us a note. So we got one today. It's coming from someone put their name as AM. It says, great show. This is appropriate considering what we just did. This is my OCD. Would love it if you guys could make the rating system clear and make sense.
I'm sorry. I apologize. We cannot. We cannot do that.
30 Days a Night was like three-quarters of a thumb, but this was with a thumbs up with a smile. I just don't get the system.
Well, that's part of the mystique. AM, I'm going to just respond directly and tell you that's part of the mystique. We're going to give you a little bit of lore. It's like a Rubik's Cube. It just takes some time to figure it out.
Yeah, I would hate to have to create a spreadsheet that aggregates the state of how many thumbs with toes and smiles behind it. So with that, what is everybody working on right now outside the show?
Oh, we're working on new Comic-Cons. We've got new Comic-Cons that we're setting out to go to. Awesome. Potentially, we're going to try to get out to DC this year and do AwesomeCon. I'd really like to do that, so I maybe get to see you guys face-to-face. Maybe we'll record a show at AwesomeCon. Go to the booth. We've got a couple of the Comic-Cons we're working on, small and large. We're just trying to create new opportunities, bring in new artists, really try to do some artist signings, some of the local signings and things of that nature. But we're just moving through and making magic happen. And you got to check out my TikTok channel because we're bringing great videos out.
I'm very excited to hear that you want to go to AwesomeCon. I never go to cons that are in my own area. I live right outside of the DC area. I never go to MagFest. I never go to AwesomeCon. If you're coming, I will make it a goal to get to AwesomeCon, to shake your hand and, welcome our thousands and thousands of Movie Smash fans to come say hi to us. So I would be down for that. That sounds very exciting. Otherwise, it's January. I'm sure that work is picked up and I'm very miserable. So I'm looking forward to doing more movies to stop thinking about real life.
Well, that's kind of funny. So I guess we might be having, I don't want to say a booth at AwesomeCon, maybe like a table in the cafeteria area.
It would be a table or perhaps an outside booth. I don't know. We'll have to figure it out. We're just kind of looking right now. I know there's a lot of applications out. We're trying to make a decision about where we want to go, but I would love, AwesomeCon was awesome. It's no other way to describe it.
For myself, by the time this episode drops, you should be able to find on our website a new suggested reading tab. That we can go in there if you want to find some more background information, the source material for these comics, go check it out. Find out what inspired these movies, what the source material was, such as, and they'll have great suggestions. Just like if you want to learn more about Watchmen, go read Watchmen. If you've enjoyed this show, please give us a review, share it with your friends. If you want to drop us a note, tell us where we are wrong, or if you want to make a movie suggestion, just visit us at movie-smash.com. And thank you for listening. Show, please give us a review and share with your friends. If you want to drop us a note, tell us where we were wrong, or give us a movie suggestion, visit us at movie-smash.com.